Now let me introduce you, Alisa. She's going to do our next story, and Alisa's story is the one we'll all surely know. It is one of the versions which is retold all over the world. The very first version was written in southern China in about 850 CE, and the story is set about 1,000 years earlier. She was so inspired by this research that she published a book on this tale. So let's hear Alisa.
Thank you. This story wouldn't be what it is without the help of Christine with her mentoring. So thank you to Christine. This is a story about a magical fish, golden shoes, and a girl who by the end gets to decide her own fate. Yexian was born in the high hills of China, in a time when bamboo books were still made and the dynasties ruled. And she was born to her family, and her father married this young woman, and her mother unfortunately died just after she was born. And Yexian's father remarried and had another daughter. Her name was Junli, and Junli followed her big sister around everywhere. Now Yexian loved her family and had a great time. She was great at poetry, she was highly intelligent, and she loved nothing more than to spin on the wheel. But one winter, an illness swept through the village, and it took her father with it. And Yexian was left all alone because her stepmother took her clothes away from her immediately and then made her do all the difficult jobs, like go into the forest and get the wood from the deepest parts of the wood and go to the deepest, darkest wells to get the water. And Yexian was deeply lonely, for she had nobody. One day when Yexian was out collecting water, she decided to take a swim. She took off her tattered clothing and washed it, and then got in the water and bathed herself. Her hair spread out in exquisite glory. And then she felt something tickle on the side of her leg. And she looked up and she saw a tiny little fish as big as a finger. And Yexian was surprised because this fish had big golden eyes, a red fin, and a moustache which reminded her of her father. Yexian looked at the fish and she knew straight away that this fish was talking to her. She knew that the fish was going to go with her. It seemed to speak to her. So she scooped it up, put it in the bucket, and she took it home. But of course she had to hide it from her stepmother because her stepmother would punish her by throwing buckets at her if she did anything wrong. So Yexian took a little bowl, put her fish in the bowl, and fed it whenever she could. But soon the fish grew and grew and grew until it was so big she couldn't hide it anymore. So she needed to find a place for it to go. So Yexian went into the forest, and in her explorations she had found a cave with a very narrow entrance. And inside the cave was a sandy bank with a big pond. And it was here that Yexian took her fish. And the fish grew, and soon it was as large as the pond itself. And every time Yexian came to visit it, it would pillow its head on the bank and she would talk to it. It had become her friend. But all good things must come to an end, must they not? One day, Yexian's stepmother asked her to do something she'd never done before. She asked her to go out into another village, a long way away, and asked her to take off her tattered clothing and go. And the task was going to take a whole day. So Yexian went off and did what her stepmother asked. Meanwhile, the stepmother put on Yexian's tattered clothing. And what had happened was her sister had followed her. And now her sister showed the stepmother the way to the cave. And when the stepmother stepped in with the tattered clothing, the fish pillowed its head on the bank. But the stepmother pulled out from her sleeve a knife and raised the knife high and chopped off the head of the fish. She gathered up the fish and took it home and ate it for dinner. Now Yexian didn't get to go visit her friend until the next day, But when she did, she sobbed with grief. She sobbed for the loss of her mother, the loss of her father, and the loss of her friend. And her tears dropped into the pond and rippled across its surface. And then Yexian saw a light in the distance. And up in the light was a spirit, a divine being that came down from the sky. And it spoke to Yexian, and it said that her fish had gone because her mother had killed it. And it told her that the bones of the fish still contained the magic of the fish, and that she needed to retrieve the bones, and with those bones she could have anything that she desired. So that is what Yexian did. She went to the dung heap, full of compost and human waste and rubbish, and she dug through every single part of it, got every single bone out of the dung heap. She took it back to the pond and she washed it with reverence, every bone. And then she wrapped all the bones in her father's shirt and kept it under her pillow where she was always close to it. If she ever needed anything, she would call on the bones and get what she needed. And life continued in this way for some time, until the blossoms, the cherry blossoms, began to blossom out, and it was time for the spring festival. And in the spring festival, people would go to trade, to exchange things, to exchange marriages, to talk about what's been going on with the seasons. But her stepmother had told her she wasn't going. She was to stay at home and look after the fruit trees. So her stepmother left with Junli, and Yexian was left alone. But after they were out of sight, Yexian made a wish on her bones. She knelt by the bones and she wished for a disguise that nobody would be able to recognize her in. And in a moment she was clad in a dress of kingfisher feathers. She was iridescent. And on her feet, golden shoes with embroidery like the scales of the fish on top, and they're really light gold at the bottom. They should have been heavy, but when she walked, she felt like she walked on air. Yexian went to the festival. She had a great time. She made lots of great connections. But it was when she overheard her sister say, "Doesn't that look like our Yexian?" that Yexian started to worry. All the blood went from her face and her heart stopped. She walked very calmly to the nearest exit, and as soon as she was out of sight, she ran. She ran so fast that she lost a shoe. She ran so fast that she didn't know that once she lost the shoe, her clothes had disappeared. And she ran so fast that when she got home, she didn't realize that the bones didn't speak to her anymore. And she was all alone again. All she had was one remaining shoe. She took the shoe, put it to her chest, and wrapped her body around the trunk of a fruit tree. Her stepmother and sister arrived home and nothing more was said. But what of the other shoe? Well, a villager found it, who gave it to a merchant, who then, seeking a favour from a powerful king, gave it to the king. The king knew at once that this was a shoe that was filled with magic, and he coveted the magic of the other shoe. So he got everybody to try it on, to try and find the owner so he could find the other shoe. But the moment anyone tried the shoe on, it shrunk. The shoe wouldn't fit anybody. It was magic, and it was enchanted, and it was made just for one. So he went around all the villages, nearby and far, and eventually he arrived at the home of Yexian. The stepmother and Junli tried on the shoe. And of course they found Yexian, and she put on the shoe too, and it fit her foot perfectly. She took out the other shoe, her dress of kingfisher feathers returned, and again she felt resplendent and powerful, and she felt wonderful. But this is not a happily ever after. The king demanded that Yexian told her where she got the shoes, and so reluctantly she told him about the shoes, the bones, and the magical fish, and the magical spirit. And the king took Yexian, the bones, and the shoes with them back to his kingdom. He made wishes on the bones and became a very, very rich man. But Yexian missed her friend the fish. She missed talking, and she couldn't hear it anymore. And because she had made the king so rich, he made her his chief wife. But still, she was very unhappy. All she wanted was her friend. One night, in the darkest night, when there was no moon, Yexian went out onto the balcony and she heard a whisper, just a little one. And she followed that whisper down the stairs, down to the river and to the sandy bank where her husband had hidden the bones. She dug in the sand and pulled out her father's shirt containing the bones and held it to her chest. Finally, that night, the tide rose and fell, and Yexian and the bones went with the tide, never to be separated again. Thank you.